Hi, welcome to the Geoeconomics YouTube channel. I'm Rob Kep, and in this installment we'll be talking about China's plans for a national security law for Hong Kong. Whether or not you have a specific interest in Hong Kong or Asia or China more generally, let me just point out that Hong Kong, although a relatively small economy, has massive geoeconomic significance. First, some quick basic economic facts about Hong Kong. Hong Kong is a Chinese commercial and financial hub. It's 7.5 million inhabitants compared to 1.4 billion in the mainland. Hong Kong also has disproportionate economic influence internally within China. Its population enjoys about 50,000 US dollars in per capita GDP, that is per person average GDP. That compares to about 4 or 5 times less in the mainland. Although originally Chinese territory, it was colonized by Britain in 1842, handed back to China in 1997 under what's known as a joint declaration between the UK and the Chinese governments. The overriding principle under which Hong Kong was returned to the mainland was what is known as one country, two systems. The second system in this case being for Hong Kong, where it was guaranteed for 50 years they would not experience any fundamental changes to their way of life, primarily regarding an independent judiciary and freedom of expression. To highlight some of Hong Kong's economic disproportionate power, again, although a small economy, it handles some 70% of the $270 billion transacted in exchange for China's currency each day. Now, as of the taping of this video in late May 2020, Hong Kong had already been in the news since about a year ago when there were protests exactly over the perceived threat of China increasingly encroaching upon Hong Kong freedoms. Now we actually have a proposed security law which has just been brought up at China's National People's Congress. So before trying to look at what that national security legislation implies, let's go back to the original joint declaration. This declaration stated very clearly in English and Chinese that the laws currently in place in Hong Kong were to remain fundamentally unchanged for at least 50 years. The joint declaration also specifically called out rights and freedoms regarding freedom of press, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, in other words, assembly, political activity. These concepts were further enshrined in China's constitution, which includes a mini constitution for Hong Kong known as the Basic Law. The key article in Hong Kong's Basic Law that's supposed to protect its way of life is Article 5 that says the socialist system as practiced in the mainland will not be practiced in Hong Kong. There is an inherent contradiction to the Basic Law, however, and that is the notorious Article 23, which also specifies that the Hong Kong authorities need to pass laws that prohibit subversion against the Chinese state. And that's open to very broad interpretation and really invites the sort of thing that we've now seen from the mainland. Now, the Chinese Communist Party was previously somewhat amenable to these sorts of contradictions. They allowed a kind of grayness to exist. We saw that under no less an authority than Mao Zedong, the founder of the People's Republic, who himself wrote a famous treatise called On Contradictions. The point here being that China, up until recently, was okay with this ambiguity that existed in Hong Kong, although it had been trying to pass some sort of security legislation previously through local authorities. However, China's current leadership, headed by General Secretary Xi Jinping, there's really a new approach to contradictions, and that is mainly not to allow them. Part of the philosophy here being that Xi Jinping is extremely paranoid about the idea of China repeating what happened in the Soviet Union, and he believes that that was caused because of plurality that emerged under Glasnost. He does not want to see anything that threatens the central government's authority, and he's starting, it seems, particularly with Hong Kong, to crack down with the NPC's new security legislation. Hong Kong protesters, it must be noted, did really present an in-the-face challenge to Xi and his administration, not only in the way the protesters specifically denounced him, but also showed allegiance to the United States, Britain, and other foreign powers. This was specifically touching on the most sensitive area of Chinese security, and that is foreign interference. Adding to the complexities here is, of course, that under a free society, as was originally enjoyed in Hong Kong, that kind of subversive activity is actually allowed. States do not conceive that as being fundamentally threatening. We see it in everything from the recent extinction protests that occurred in London to the million men, million women, any sorts of demonstrations you see on Washington. There's a whole variety of political dissent that's tolerated in the modern world, at least in democracies. And that's exactly what's supposed to be guaranteed in Hong Kong. So that's essentially where we see the two forces at play right now with Hong Kong. The Chinese state authority viewing any sorts of challenge to its rights as a government to be considered subversive and illustrations of foreign interference, versus the fact that that kind of dissent is actually allowed and should have been allowed under the guarantees provided for 50 years. So there's a lot of nuance at work in understanding what's really happening in Hong Kong at this stage. However, there are a couple of basic points that are worth bearing in mind. The first, there's a net negative effect regardless of what one's position is on the matter, that this provides another example of China not honoring its international commitments, whatever its reasons for not doing so. So this will have a hugely negative effect on China's geopolitical influence as this plays out. The second big issue here, and this applies not only to Hong Kong, but what happens in China with all sorts of foreign enterprises and interest of foreign governments for transparency in China, is that anything can be considered a matter of national security. China uses this time and time again to refuse to be transparent about the workings of its system, even about the workings of private companies. It claims national security as a reason for not being forthcoming with information. We see this especially, by the way, during the time of COVID. The third point to bear in mind, and this is very important for China's long-term economic prosperity, is that transparency in governance, which history has shown is absolutely fundamental towards economic progression, that cannot be achieved if you have any party with monopoly on power, because the party can always work against the goals of transparency and governance, which are accountability. This is the biggest issue China faces. Near term, yes, it can bring its will to bear upon Hong Kong. It can do it in some other places as well. It can certainly continue to do it in mainland China, but long term, that works against its interest in developing a truly thriving economy, and one that other foreign powers are willing to engage on an equal basis. And to conclude on some geoeconomic significance here. One is that this definitely represents a downward tipping point in China's foreign relations. The second major geoeconomic factor here is that this could represent a hollowing out of Hong Kong's global connectivity. That's not only of great significance to the people of Hong Kong and the many foreign businesses that like to use Hong Kong as a base of operations for the region and for entering mainland China specifically, but in fact, it's also a major blow for China's interest, where Hong Kong has served as a platform for interconnecting with the rest of the global economy. And thirdly, this is really bad timing for China's interest. One, it comes on the heels of China having all sorts of criticism for its handling of the outbreak of COVID-19. And secondly, if you've been following the financial news, it's very likely Chinese companies will be booted off of US stock exchanges over the next 3 years. If that comes to pass, the logical place for them to go would be Hong Kong, which is the next best option to the US Wall Street markets. However, if Hong Kong starts imploding because of the issues around national security legislation, that could basically pull the rug out from these companies that are going to have to leave Wall Street. Thanks for watching. I welcome your comments, and if you'd like to follow future installments from Geoeconomics YouTube channel, please do subscribe and sign up for notifications. Look forward to seeing you back here soon.